Her male architect thought that she was helping volunteers, but she was with the future. Matt walked into the house, masking his exhaustion after a long day. His hands still carried the faint scent of wood and varnish, a reminder of the massive project he was working on that would transform the city's skyline. Dropping his briefcase by the door and shrugging off his jacket, he noticed Kaylee darting around the kitchen, nervously rummaging through her purse. Her face bore the same tension he'd noticed earlier that morning, but he had chosen not to bring it up. "Heading out again?" Matt asked casually, though a hint of curiosity slipped into his tone. "Yes, I've got to attend a charity event." "It's work-related," Kaylee replied, avoiding eye contact as she continued searching her bag. "At 10 at night?" His casual curiosity shifted into mild skepticism. "There will be volunteers there. It's kind of a private gathering. I told you we're organizing a campaign for the homeless." Matt nodded, though her explanation felt less than convincing. Kaylee leaned in for a quick hug, pressed a hurried kiss to his cheek, and dashed out the door, leaving only the faint trace of her perfume behind. Now alone in the stillness of the house, Matt tried to relax. The TV was off, and the silence in the living room was almost oppressive. He wandered into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and noticed a small package on the coffee table. A neatly attached note read, "Thank you for last night, D." His eyebrows furrowed in confusion. D. He picked up the package and examined it. Inside was a sleek, expensive-looking set of hand tools. Kaylee had mentioned gifting volunteers before, but the note seemed strangely personal. Matt's mind resisted the idea of anything suspicious. Kaylee had often worked late or attended charity events, always coming back with stories of the people she'd helped. He respected her passion and dedication. But this note, it felt too intimate, too casual. Setting the package aside, Matt headed to the bedroom. He told himself it was nothing, blaming his thoughts on paranoia. For a moment, he even considered taking a photo of the note, but dismissed the idea, thinking it would be ridiculous. Later that evening, just as he was getting ready for bed, his phone lit up unexpectedly. A message from his friend Aaron appeared, accompanied by a photo. Opening it, Matt froze. The picture showed Kaylee seated at a restaurant table with a man Matt didn't recognize. They looked relaxed, laughing, leaning in close to each other. "Is this your wife?" Aaron's message read. Matt stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. He could confront Kaylee directly, but something stopped him. Instead, he turned off his phone and lay down, his mind racing. The next morning, Kaylee acted as if nothing had happened. She made coffee, chatted about the news, and even suggested going out for dinner that weekend. Her behavior seemed genuine, almost reassuring, yet the photo lingered in Matt's mind. "How was your night?" he asked, studying her reaction carefully. "Great. We discussed a lot of important ideas. I feel like it'll really make a difference," she said confidently, her tone so convincing that Matt almost doubted his suspicions. Still, he couldn't shake the image of her and the stranger at the restaurant. Matt began to watch her more closely. He noticed how she always kept her phone face down, left the room for important calls, and grew distant whenever he asked about her day. A week passed, and the doubts gnawed at him. His work suffered, focus evaded him, and sleepless nights became his norm. He needed the truth, but dreaded what it might do to the life they had built together. One evening, Matt came home earlier than usual and noticed new boxes in the garage. They were labeled as furniture. "What's this for?" he asked. "Oh, it's for the office at our charity organization," Kaylee replied confidently, but her tone struck Matt as rehearsed. That night, Matt made a decision. He met Aaron at a bar and showed him the photo. "It happened a few days ago," Aaron said. "I thought you should know." "Are you sure it was the same night she said she was going to the charity gala?" "Positive. I've seen her with this guy more than once." Aaron's words hit Matt like a bolt of lightning. He couldn't ignore the obvious any longer, but he knew he had to tread carefully. He needed more evidence to uncover the truth and wanted to approach this as thoughtfully as possible. Matt sat in his workshop, the recent events looping in his mind. His instincts told him not to jump to conclusions, but his heart ached with doubt. Kaylee had always been the epitome of honesty and openness to him, but the past few weeks made him question if he truly knew her. Setting aside the blueprints he'd been working on, Matt unlocked his phone and stared at the photo Aaron had sent him. The image of Kaylee at the restaurant with another man looked too intimate to brush off as innocent. Still, Matt resolved not to act impulsively. He needed more facts. That evening, when Kaylee got home, she seemed unusually excited. Her eyes sparkled, and her voice was full of enthusiasm. "Matt, I have to tell you something. Our office is finally getting a complete makeover. Can you believe it? We're finally going to have the space we've dreamed of. And the best part? We've hired a professional construction team to handle it." Matt smiled, masking the turmoil inside. "That sounds fantastic. What are you planning to do?" Kaylee launched into a detailed description of the renovation plans. Sleek designs, comfortable new furniture already being delivered, and how it would transform their work environment. She was so happy that Matt almost dismissed his suspicions. "Who's handling the construction?" he asked casually. "A local team. They're really good, professional and talented. I even made friends with one of them. He's so skilled. Just like you," she added with a warm smile. Her comment made Matt's stomach churn. He kept his composure, but questions swirled in his mind. Was this skilled builder the same man from the restaurant? The next morning, Matt offered to drive Kaylee to work. She seemed surprised but agreed. "You haven't been to our office in ages. Why don't you come in and see how it looks before the renovations?" she suggested. Matt declined, citing a work meeting, but after Kaylee walked inside, he stayed parked nearby, watching. The office was in a typical city building. Outside, a truck loaded with tools was parked, and a group of men was unloading materials. Among them, Matt spotted a tall blond man in work clothes, talking animatedly with Kaylee. They laughed together, and then she lightly touched his shoulder. A wave of anger surged through Matt, but he held it in. He decided to dig deeper and called Aaron, who worked nearby and might know more. "Aaron, are you absolutely sure Kaylee was with that guy at the restaurant?" Matt asked during his lunch break. 100% sure. I even have more photos if you want to see." Aaron pulled out his phone and scrolled through his gallery. The images clearly showed Kaylee sitting close to the same blonde man, their faces too close for it to be just a casual conversation. "Maybe it's connected to her work," Matt said, clinging to the possibility. "Look, man, I know this is hard, but you deserve to know the truth," Aaron said sympathetically. Back home, Matt decided to change his approach. He no longer wanted to wait for the truth to reveal itself. Instead, he began carefully questioning Kaylee about the renovation, paying close attention to any inconsistencies in her story. She eagerly shared details about the project, but Matt noticed she avoided mentioning specific names or anything personal. "What's the name of that guy you mentioned? The one you said was so talented?" Matt asked suddenly. "Guy? Oh, you mean Dan. He's the lead on the construction team. Super professional," she replied, avoiding eye contact. Dan, Matt thought. The D from the note. The talented builder. The man from the restaurant. Everything was starting to click. The next day, Matt took a day off work without telling Kaylee. He followed her discreetly, determined to uncover the truth. Kaylee arrived at the office as usual, but after a few hours, she left with Dan. They got into his truck and drove off together. Matt followed them, keeping a safe distance. He watched as they pulled into a small restaurant on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anywhere near her office, definitely not the kind of place for a casual work lunch. He parked nearby and started observing. Dan and Kaylee sat at a table by the window, chatting and laughing. At one point, Dan reached across the table and took her hand. Matt felt his fists clench involuntarily. He couldn't ignore what was right in front of him anymore. Still, he decided not to make a scene. Instead, he discreetly took a photo of them together. Undeniable proof. Back home, Matt sat in silence, replaying everything in his mind. He knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. He began planning how to confront Kaylee and expose her lies, but he wanted to do it thoughtfully and with impact. That evening, Matt sat on the couch, trying to calm his thoughts. The night outside was foggy, and even his favorite chair didn't bring any comfort. Kaylee had just walked in, cheerful as ever, leaving him alone with his conflicted thoughts. His gaze fell to his phone, where he'd saved the pictures he'd taken. The image of Dan holding her hand, her smiling as if there wasn't a care in the world. It was burned into his mind. Her words from earlier, about heading to a volunteer party, now felt hollow. She had said her work was important, and that she and Dan were collaborating on a charity project. But then why were they at a cafe so far from the office, looking so close? Kaylee approached him with a tired but content expression. "Hey, love. How was your day?" she asked, taking off her coat with a light smile. Matt composed himself, keeping his tone calm. "It was fine. How about you? How's the project coming along?" She started recounting her day, explaining how important it was to finish the renovations on time. Her enthusiasm was palpable as she shared details about the project. In her voice, there wasn't even a hint of guilt or dishonesty. "Dan and I went to a cafe today," she mentioned casually. "He showed me some new layout ideas for the office. Can you believe it? We're expanding. There'll be so much more space for the team and volunteers." Matt nodded, fighting to keep his expression neutral. Inside, his suspicions only grew. The way she spoke about Dan felt personal. "What else is new?" he asked, keeping the conversation light. Kaylee shared more updates about the office redesign, her excitement shining through every word. Everything she said seemed professional, yet Matt couldn't shake the unease growing inside him. "By the way," he asked suddenly, "what's this Dan like? You seem to work with him a lot." "Dan?" she repeated, pausing briefly. "Oh, he's great. Very talented and professional. Honestly, he reminds me a little of you." She smiled, but her eyes darted away for a moment. Dan, Matt thought to himself. The D from the note. The talented guy she'd mentioned before. The man from the restaurant. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. The next morning, Matt took the day off without telling Kaylee. When she left for work, he decided to follow her. As usual, she went to her office, but a few hours later, she walked out with Dan. They got into his truck and drove off together. Matt followed them again, his heart pounding. They arrived at another restaurant, far from the office. Matt parked and watched as they entered. Inside, Dan and Kaylee sat at a corner table, their body language too intimate to ignore. At one point, Dan leaned closer, and she rested her hand on his. Matt's anger flared, but he restrained himself. He took another photo, knowing it would be all the proof he needed. That evening, he called Aaron, his trusted friend, to meet for coffee. At their usual spot, Aaron listened attentively as Matt laid everything out. The photos, the suspicious outings, Kaylee's evasive answers. "I don't know, man," Matt said, running a hand through his hair. "I've talked to her. She's told me everything seems above board, but something just feels off." Aaron sipped his coffee, his brow furrowed. "Look, I get why you're worried. It does sound strange, but maybe it's nothing. Kaylee's always been honest with you, right? Maybe you should just ask her directly, calmly, without accusations. See what she says." "I've tried," Matt replied. "She answers everything, but I still can't shake this feeling. It's like something's not adding up." Aaron leaned back, considering his words. "Then maybe it's time for a different approach. If you really think something's wrong, you need to find out the truth, but don't let it eat you up in the process." Matt nodded, feeling a mix of doubt and determination. He didn't want to hurt Kaylee, but the weight of his suspicions was becoming unbearable. Something had to give. Matt returned home after the conversation with Aaron, determined to address his growing doubts directly with Kaylee. She was sitting at her desk, working on a report for the charity organization. Her usual bright demeanor seemed subdued. He walked over and sat down beside her. "Kaylee, I need to talk to you," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. She looked up from her documents, her expression shifting to mild concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, noting the seriousness in his tone. "I appreciate you telling me about work and your projects, but I need to know what's really going on between you and Dan. I saw you two at the cafe, and it's been bothering me," he said plainly. Kaylee flinched ever so slightly, but then she laughed, a light chuckle that felt rehearsed. "Oh, Matt, your imagination is running wild. It's just work. You know that. We're discussing projects, making plans. I've even told you about our meetings. Why are you so worried?" she replied, her smile warm but not entirely convincing. Matt nodded, but couldn't shake the lingering unease. While her words seemed logical, her demeanor felt too polished, as if she was deflecting. The days that followed were heavy for Matt. He tried to maintain their usual routine, suppressing his doubts, but the unease persisted. Kaylee appeared calm and confident, but her increasing closeness with Dan became impossible to ignore. She frequently mentioned work projects and late-night tasks, yet something about her explanations felt off. One evening, when she came home late, Matt noticed her phone left unattended on the kitchen counter. Though he despised the idea of invading her privacy, his curiosity overwhelmed him. The phone was on silent, which struck him as odd. Kaylee rarely muted her notifications. He glanced at the screen and noticed a few missed calls, but what caught his eye was a message from an unknown number. It wasn't explicitly incriminating, but the vagueness stirred his suspicions. Guilt weighed on him, but so did his growing mistrust. He started noticing subtle inconsistencies. Items moved around the house, tools appearing and disappearing, and faint traces of unfamiliar scents. Though small, these details began to form a troubling picture. Determined to piece things together, Matt started paying closer attention to Kaylee's behavior. One day, she mentioned spending the evening with friends, but when he pressed for details, she quickly changed the subject, talking about out-of-town visitors instead. Her avoidance only deepened his doubts. Matt wrestled with his thoughts. Was he overthinking? Or were his instincts pointing to a truth he wasn't ready to face? He decided to remain patient, gathering more observations before making any accusations. Kaylee's growing detachment was undeniable. She spoke often of exhaustion from work, yet she seemed to have ample energy for volunteering and other social engagements. These inconsistencies gnawed at Matt, making him question everything he thought he knew about their relationship. The once familiar rhythm of their lives had shifted, and Matt couldn't escape the sinking feeling that something vital had been lost. Whether it was his own paranoia or an unspoken reality, he knew he couldn't ignore it much longer. Matt decided that he needed to get to the bottom of all these suspicions. One day, he received an invitation to dinner from his colleagues, bosses, and city officials with whom he had been working on several major projects. It was an important event, and he had to show his confidence. However, what happened that evening turned out to be an unexpected twist for him. When Matt entered the restaurant, he was dressed elegantly, as usual, ready to engage in important negotiations. His colleagues were already there, discussing various aspects of upcoming projects. But what he saw next made his heart skip a beat. He came to speak with people he knew, but Matt noticed an unfamiliar face among the guests. It was Dan, the builder with whom Kaylee often worked. Matt immediately realized that this wasn't just a casual acquaintance, as Dan walked up to him, smiled, and greeted him. "Hey Matt, I'm Dan. I work with your wife a lot. Kaylee does such a great job organizing everything. She's a real professional," he said, shaking Matt's hand. Matt felt a sense of tension in the air, but tried not to show his emotions. He smiled and replied, "Thanks, Dan. Yeah, she's really great at what she does." During dinner, Dan continued to praise Kaylee, talking about how much he enjoyed working with her, how she was always helpful, and how she had great ideas to improve projects. He spoke with such enthusiasm that it didn't just feel like professionalism. It felt like something more. Matt felt something cold inside him. He couldn't understand why Dan was so focused on his wife. This wasn't just a compliment. It was too personal. Each time Dan mentioned Kaylee, he paused and looked at Matt, almost as if trying to gauge his reaction. Matt tried not to show concern, but inside, he felt increasingly uneasy. His thoughts were scattered, like butterflies that couldn't find their place. At the end of the evening, when everyone had left and Matt returned home, he couldn't shake the thought of Dan's admiration for Kaylee. He was starting to doubt whether their relationship was really just professional. No matter how hard he tried to convince himself that it was just part of their working relationship, his intuition told him otherwise. The next day, when Matt arrived at work, he received several photos from his friend Aaron. Aaron worked in the same area as Kaylee's office, and from time to time, he would drop by when she was at work. This time, the photos showed Kaylee and Dan sitting in a cafe together, discussing some documents. Dan was holding her hand, and Kaylee was smiling at him. Matt felt his heart skip again. He couldn't figure out if it was just a casual moment or something more. The photos added even more doubt in his mind. They didn't look like just a professional meeting. They looked more like a meeting between two people who had a closer relationship. Matt couldn't believe that Kaylee and Dan could just be colleagues when there was such an obvious closeness between them. Matt decided that this time, he couldn't leave things to chance. He needed to get to the bottom of everything. He no longer had any doubts that something was wrong. He couldn't stay in the dark anymore, couldn't ignore the signs that pointed to Kaylee's suspicious behavior. All the little details were coming together into a bigger picture, and it was becoming more and more obvious. He had to find out if it was just a professional relationship, or if there was something more between her and Dan. Matt didn't know exactly how to proceed, but he was sure that the more he uncovered, the more would be revealed. And even though he was afraid of what he might find, he understood that he couldn't leave this question unanswered. He needed to see the whole truth, no matter what it might be. Matt realized that he needed more evidence to learn more. He thought maybe his wife was hiding something. Matt sat in the dark, holding Kaylee's phone in his hands. He knew it was the wrong move, but his doubts wouldn't let him rest. He had long noticed that Kaylee had become more closed off and distant. Every time he tried to talk about their relationship or figure out why she kept staying late, she would give the same excuse. She was tired from work. It was a standard phrase she kept repeating more and more. But Matt couldn't ignore what was troubling him. What he had seen in the photos from Aaron and his encounter with Dan at dinner. All of it made him question everything. He took a deep breath and opened the phone, knowing that his actions could have serious consequences. As he scrolled through the messages, emails, and calls, he didn't find anything suspicious. The phone was clean. No secret messages, no mysterious calls. Matt felt both disappointment and relief. He didn't want to be the kind of man who invaded his wife's privacy, but the suspicions wouldn't go away. He put the phone on the table and thought, maybe all of this was just his imagination, his growing inner fears that had been building up as Kaylee became more distant. But in his heart, there was still a lingering unease. Kaylee was different. She had become less available, said less, and even her gaze seemed absent when she looked at him. It wasn't the same look he was used to seeing in her eyes. She no longer laughed when he joked, no longer joked herself, and although she still promised him everything was fine, Matt felt her words didn't ring true. The next day, Kaylee again mentioned that she was having a tough day at work. She told Matt that a meeting with volunteers would take a few hours and promised to return later. Matt decided that today he would take another look at everything, so he went into the city to occupy himself with some tasks. His mind kept turning over various possibilities for why she had been so distant. Maybe it was just a break for her, or perhaps she was stressed about work. But those explanations didn't seem entirely convincing. Meanwhile, while wandering the city, Matt accidentally discovered something very interesting. As he was leaving a furniture store, he overheard Kaylee's name. One of the salespeople was discussing a recent order. It was an amount he couldn't forget, an order for furniture for an apartment. Furniture Matt was sure he hadn't seen at home. Matt paused, wondering if he had heard correctly. He immediately remembered how Kaylee had talked about work, how often she was busy, how she hadn't even mentioned the new furniture. Maybe this really was part of her project, but why hadn't she shared this information with him? She had always been open with him, and this secrecy seemed suspicious. That evening, when he returned home and while Kaylee was in the shower, he decided to check things out again. He started gathering information about the furniture ordered for the apartment. But Kaylee came back and caught him in the act. "Matt, what are you doing?" Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension. "I'm just trying to figure out why we have this furniture." "You didn't tell me anything about new purchases," he said, looking at her, trying to find an answer in her eyes. Kaylee froze for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. "It's for a project, I told you. For the new volunteer office. I just didn't have time to share all the details," she said, her words coming out a bit too firmly, but Matt noticed how her eyes avoided his. It wasn't her usual behavior. Matt stood there, watching her. A sense of uncertainty bloomed inside him again. Why had she been so closed off? Why hadn't she mentioned the furniture before? He felt that something in their relationship was starting to crack, and although he didn't have concrete proof that Kaylee was cheating, her behavior made him suspicious. "I understand, Kaylee, but I'd like to know more about this. We need to be open with each other, he said, trying to stay calm. Kaylee didn't respond right away. She seemed nervous, and her voice had a weariness to it. I just want to help. This is important to me. You know how much I invest in my work and charity. It's just a few things for the new office, nothing more. She quickly regrouped and shifted the conversation elsewhere. Matt knew that this issue wouldn't be resolved right now. He felt like he needed more time to understand why Kaylee had changed so much. And even if he didn't have evidence of infidelity, he already felt that something was seriously wrong. His intuition hadn't let him down, and now he knew that he had to act carefully to uncover the whole truth about his wife. Matt felt a cold sense of anxiety growing inside him when Kaylee suggested throwing a party. At first, it seemed like a simple idea to get away from work, relax a little, and spend time with friends. But in Kaylee's eyes, when she talked about it, Matt noticed something that made him uneasy. She was too eager to make it perfect. Her voice carried that same subtle tension that had been becoming more frequent lately. She had already started planning, inviting people, and even rearranging things around their home. Kaylee suggested showing off the new furniture she had ordered, saying it was all for her work. The furniture for the new volunteer office was supposed to be the centerpiece of the evening. Matt found this a little strange. He couldn't understand why so much attention was being given to this party and why she was so eager for everyone to see the furniture. Matt didn't object, though he couldn't understand why Kaylee was so nervous about organizing the event. He agreed, since it seemed like just a way to escape the routine, and he himself didn't mind spending an evening with her friends and colleagues. The evening came quickly. Kaylee was busy preparing, arranging chairs, setting the tables, preparing snacks. It all looked like it wasn't just a party but a real event. Matt noticed that even the smallest details seemed important to Kaylee. She carefully chose the music, selected the wines, set beautiful candles on the tables, things he hadn't seen in a long time. She clearly wanted to impress the guests. The guests began to arrive in the evening. Most of them were familiar to Matt, Kaylee's colleagues from the organization, a few of her friends, and others he had never seen before. Everyone was very polite, interested in what Kaylee was doing, and constantly complimented her on her achievements, dedication, and noble goals. And although all of this was pleasant, Matt couldn't shake the feeling that all these people were more interesting to Kaylee than he was. He noticed how easily she interacted with them, how her eyes lit up when she talked about her projects and, of course, the new furniture for the office. It was as if she had forgotten about him, and he was left as a mere observer. The party was in full swing. Music played, drinks flowed, and the guests relaxed and began dancing. Everything was going as Kaylee had planned. Parties, laughter, cheerful conversations, and carefree moments. But Matt noticed one thing that immediately caught his attention: Dan. He was among the last to arrive at the party. Kaylee was obviously thrilled to see him. She ran to meet him, and it looked more like an intimate greeting than just a hello. Dan, tall, with confident steps, a smile that never left his face. He looked as if he wasn't just a construction worker but one of the central figures of the evening. Matt immediately felt a sense of tension when Dan approached Kaylee. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke with him, laughing at his jokes, and his gaze was so focused on her that Matt couldn't help but feel uneasy. Dan seemed to be present in everything, in every movement Kaylee made, in her playful responses, and the way she held his attention. Matt couldn't help but notice how, with each passing minute, they became more and more familiar with each other. Dan took Kaylee's hand, pulled her onto the dance floor, and they began to dance together, laughing and nudging each other in play. Kaylee was happy, clearly enjoying the interaction. She didn't seem to notice Matt, not even glancing at him when he tried to talk to her. Matt stayed on the sidelines, unable to bring himself to approach them. It all seemed too unnatural. He couldn't understand why Dan, a construction worker with no connection to their social circle, had garnered Kaylee's attention. He wasn't one of them, didn't share their interests, and wasn't part of their group, but somehow, he was the center of attention. Matt felt like an outsider, isolated, as if he were an unnecessary element at his own party. With every passing minute, his irritation grew. Matt couldn't watch any longer as Kaylee and Din became the main characters of the evening, forgetting about him. He saw Din lean in close to Kaylee, and she laughed softly, as if sharing some special secret with him. All this time, Matt remained quiet, unnoticed, but his heart was racing faster. What was going on between them? Could it be just friendship? But why did he feel like a third wheel in their company? Why was Kaylee, who had always put family first, so distant now? Matt watched as Din and Kaylee embraced on the dance floor, and his feelings became mixed. He tried not to focus too much on what was happening between them, since the party was meant to relax, forget about problems, and enjoy the moment. The party continued, but for Matt, this moment was a turning point. He couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. He decided it was time to talk to Kaylee. So he stood up and approached her when she was with Din again, smiling and completely focused on him. When Matt came up to Kaylee, he hugged her from behind. She turned to him, and though she smiled, there was something in her eyes that made Matt feel that she wasn't quite ready for this. She quickly let go of his hug and stepped back a few paces, as if signaling that she wanted more space. Kaylee, trying to restore the atmosphere, immediately began telling the guests how lucky she was to have Matt as a husband. She praised him for his talents, for how he handled the construction of their house, and how wonderful and supportive he was. For Matt, it was nice, although something in her behavior felt a little excessive. If this had been a normal conversation, he wouldn't have paid much attention, but now he felt a strange pressure in her words, as if she was trying to prove something, or perhaps even justify herself. Din, sensing an opportunity for an interesting conversation, began to ask about the details of building the house. He asked Matt how they built the big house, if there had been any difficulties, and why they chose that particular design. Matt, interested, began to share, recalling all the challenges and pleasant moments of the process. As he answered Din's questions, he noticed how intently Din listened, watching every movement, never looking away, and even trying to insert his own comments, adding more details to the conversation. At first, everything seemed normal. Matt even felt a bit of pride as he shared his experience with Din, and the atmosphere of the party started to feel less tense for him. He felt that after this conversation, he could relax a bit, and even asked Kaylee if she wanted to join him on the dance floor. Kaylee raised an eyebrow and, smiling, nodded, though she remained very reserved in her movements, still keeping her distance. Din once again invited Kaylee to dance. They quickly fell into each other's arms, and Matt saw them moving in rhythm to the music as if there were no barriers between them. Kaylee looked, as always, attractive and carefree, but Matt felt a chill run down his spine as he watched Din hold her at the waist, their movements smooth and synchronized. He tried to step aside, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Everything seemed too perfect. Din and Kaylee were discussing some trivialities about their work, talking about projects, future plans, and Matt heard Din ask a question that immediately caught his attention. "What do you think, Kaylee? Is it possible to start a new project this year? It seems like you and Matt have a lot of potential for that." Kaylee responded as if this conversation was perfectly normal. She said that they were discussing new opportunities to expand the business, but Matt couldn't hold back and asked, "What kind of projects?" Din immediately stopped, looked at him, and with an overly sinister smile, replied, "Oh, nothing special, just talking about new ideas. Kaylee has been interested in a lot of things lately." His gaze was distant, but there was something unclear about it that unsettled Matt. This question wasn't just about business, it contained some ambiguity. Matt tried not to show his agitation, but his heart was racing faster. Why did this question seem so important? And why did Din turn to Kaylee again, after they had just finished their conversation about business? This wasn't just any normal conversation. It seemed more like an attempt to establish a connection with Kaylee on a different level, one that was no longer about work. Kaylee and Dan kept dancing, and though everything appeared carefree, Matt couldn't shake the feeling that behind those embraces and conversations, there might be something more, something beyond just friendship. They danced, laughed, and their connection seemed so natural, so carefree, but for Matt, it was all just a facade they were trying to create for everyone around them to hide what was probably lurking beneath the surface. Matt stepped outside, needing to breathe the fresh air because he was growing increasingly nervous about Kaylee. He stood outside, trying to calm his heart, which kept racing from what he had just seen. Dan and Kaylee were dancing, laughing, and hugging. Matt had sensed something between them for a while, but tonight it had become too obvious. He needed to breathe deeply because his mind was spinning. The pressure on his chest was growing, and he needed a moment to collect himself. As he stood on the porch, taking in the cold air, a woman approached him, one of the ones Kaylee worked with. Matt recognized her, though he didn't know her well. She was young, energetic, with a slight accent, and her name was Laura. She walked up to him with curiosity in her eyes and asked, "Hi, Matt. How are you? Everything okay?" He nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just needed to get some fresh air." "I get it. But have you noticed how much time Kaylee's been spending with Dan lately?" Laura asked, looking him straight in the eyes. Matt was caught off guard by her bluntness. He stood silent for a few seconds, trying to gather his thoughts. "What do you mean?" he finally asked, trying to keep his tone calm, though inside he was already growing more anxious. Laura smiled and shrugged slightly. "Well, I've just noticed they're often together, not just at work. I remember last week, they stayed late after work. Everyone else left, but they stayed talking about something. Doesn't that seem a little odd? Kaylee and Dan spending so much time together." Matt felt his heart rate quicken. He tried to keep calm, but her words weren't helping. "It's just a friendship or work-related stuff. Nothing like that," he replied, though his voice was tense. "Maybe, but it doesn't seem quite so usual to me," Laura added, giving him a mysterious smile. Matt understood she wasn't trying to confuse him, but her words felt like a blade, cutting deeper into his subconscious. He glanced at the windows of the house, and seeing his own tension, Laura said, "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. Maybe it's just your suspicions, but sometimes it's better not to ignore things like this." She quickly turned back toward the house, leaving Matt in thought. He stood for a few more seconds, trying to organize his thoughts. Had he really just imagined it? Or was there something more he didn't know? With a deep breath, he headed back inside. The guests were still having fun, but the atmosphere was now hard to ignore. Matt felt his heart clench as he couldn't find either Kaylee or Dan among the guests. He started searching through the rooms, checking every corner of the house. Suddenly, from the other side of the house, he heard a familiar voice. It was Kaylee's. Her voice was quiet, but there was a certain tension in it. Matt quietly headed in the direction where her voice sounded the loudest. He climbed the stairs, and as he walked down the hallway, he saw through the window Kaylee standing on the balcony with Dan. They were talking, laughing, and something in their gestures made Matt's heart race faster than usual. That moment was decisive. He could no longer stay silent. Gathering his strength, Matt shouted, "Kaylee, Dan, what's going on here?" Both of them turned instantly at the sound of his voice. Kaylee looked at him, startled, while Dan raised his eyebrows and stepped back a few paces. Matt could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Anger and disappointment overwhelmed him. "What does all this mean?" he shouted, getting closer to them. Kaylee tried to calm him down, approaching him with a faint smile. "Matt, calm down, everything's fine. It's just a conversation. Nothing serious." But Matt could no longer control his emotions. Feeling his anger building, he asked, almost through clenched teeth, "Just a conversation? What kind of conversation is this when I see you both here together? And why couldn't I find you in the house?" Dan, clearly nervous, took a step forward. "Matt, maybe you just don't understand." But Matt cut him off. "No, I understand more than you think. This isn't just a conversation. What's going on between you two?" Kaylee stepped back, slightly tilting her head. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something, but then fell silent. Matt felt his anger slowly shift into something else, as pain and sadness merged into a single feeling. He realized he couldn't take it anymore. "Matt, you need to lie down. You don't look good," Kaylee said, noticing him clutching his head. "Yeah, I feel bad," he replied, "really bad. My stomach hurts. So you better call an ambulance." Dan and Kaylee, concerned, quickly sprang into action. They called for an ambulance, and within minutes, Matt was in the back of the vehicle, being rushed to the hospital. In his mind, one thought kept spinning. How far had he gone with his lies, and could he stop it all now? Matt returned home, feeling drained after a day at the hospital. All those fake symptoms, those deceitful statements, he couldn't understand why he had gone so far. He had always tried to be honest, but today he crossed a line. Yet, despite all this, there was one thing he knew for certain. He no longer had any doubts about what was going on between Kaylee and Denver. And the fact that he felt so terrible was just the tip of the iceberg that was only now beginning to sink into his mind. Approaching the house, he saw through the window that Kaylee was coming inside with Dylan. Matt was surprised, as he was sure no one would be home, but they had come together. There was something off in their conversation, but what he heard made his heart beat faster. "We need to be careful," Kaylee said, her voice sounding like she was trying to calm him down. Matt froze. Not knowing why he still stood on the doorstep, he continued to watch them through the window. Then things got worse. Kaylee moved closer to Dylan and seemed to forget everything around her. She placed her hands on his shoulders and with a tender smile, began kissing him. It wasn't just a goodbye kiss. It was something more, something beyond mutual affection. Matt felt a chill wash over him and realized it wasn't an accident. They were together, and not just at work. They were inside, leaving Matt in the shadows. He couldn't figure out what to do, but now, he felt he needed to know more. He needed to understand what exactly he had stumbled upon. While they were inside, Matt quietly approached the window and pressed his ear against it. The sounds he heard were so clear that each word seemed to pierce his consciousness, and he realized he couldn't hold back anymore. "We have to do this, Kaylee," he heard Dylan's voice. "We need to think about the future. All this furniture, the new house. You'll get everything. You'll have everything you want, as long as we're careful. Let's leave Matt aside, and everything will be fine." Matt felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. These words echoed in his head. They were already discussing the future. They were planning together, looking at new furniture and new apartments. Kaylee, the one he loved, seemed to be part of that plan. And all this time, he was just a tool in their game. Matt decided not to go inside right away. He stood outside, out of their sight, waiting for them to come out to see what else they were planning. He realized that what they were doing wasn't an accident. They were truly planning a new life. And he wasn't part of it. Finally, after a few minutes of silence, the door opened. Kaylee and Dylan stepped outside, laughing and talking as if nothing had happened. Matt carefully entered the house. He saw how the workshop was filled with new furniture. Furniture he had never seen before. They were large, elegant sofas, chairs, tables, everything for the new home, for the life they were building together. The fact that they had ordered office furniture was just part of the lie. Matt clenched his fists as he looked at the furniture and realized that this was more than just betrayal. This was betrayal on every level: emotional, psychological, financial. This was real manipulation, the kind he had allowed. "Is this what you want, Kaylee?" he quietly muttered, staring at the furniture they had already picked for themselves. Now it wasn't just a matter of trust. It was a question of how long he had been blind to what was happening right under his nose. He could feel his inner pain and frustration building up inside him. And now, with all the lies, manipulations, and secrets laid bare, he understood one thing. This was the last straw. What he had seen and heard could no longer be forgotten. Matt left the workshop without even looking at Kaylee when she reappeared. There was more in his eyes than just anger, more than just painful reaction. It was something dark and cold, reflecting all the emptiness he felt inside. "Yeah, Kaylee, you got everything you wanted," he said calmly, though his voice was filled with rage. "But this isn't over." Matt stood in the center of the room, looking at the furniture that had recently been bought for Kaylee and Dylan's new life. It was a symbol of what he had lost. Matt hadn't just lost love. He had lost his place in the world that he had been trying to build with Kaylee. But now everything had changed. He was ready to take back at least what was still in his hands. He took a few steps and sat at his desk, where he used to spend hours working on his projects, home repairs, and future plans. Now it all felt so distant, so foreign. It was hard to breathe as he imagined Kaylee and Dylan laughing together, talking about their plans. "You'll get everything you want," he recalled her words. And now he had decided to give her exactly what she asked for. He had to take it all, and leave nothing behind. Kaylee began searching for him, first in the house, then outside. She called and sent texts, but Matt didn't respond. Each call only fueled his irritation, and at the same time, a sense of justice. He wasn't willing to leave anything for her anymore. Kaylee calmed herself, collected her thoughts, and went to the house. As soon as she entered, she immediately noticed that something was missing. The furniture was gone. At first, she thought it was temporary. Maybe Matt had just decided to move things around. But when she walked into the room where the large sofa and wardrobe had been, she realized this wasn't just a rearrangement. "Matt," she shouted, "this was our home." She ran to the workshop and saw the empty space. No furniture, no sign of what had once been her place. The whole illusion of comfort they had built together had disappeared. Kaylee felt the cold seep into her heart, and she knew that something serious had happened. She began running through the house, trying to figure out where everything had gone. Then she realized this was done on purpose. This was his plan. Now she felt confused, powerless, wounded. Tears filled her eyes, but it didn't change the situation. "Matt," she cried out, "why did you do this?" Matt stood in front of her, looking at her with a cold expression. His eyes were calm, but there was a confidence in them that hadn't been there before. "You want to take everything back?" he asked calmly, without raising his voice. "You want me to give it all back to you?" Kaylee froze in place, not knowing what to answer. Her heart ached with every word Matt said because she knew he wasn't joking. He had really taken it all. She couldn't believe it. "I did everything for you to be happy," he continued. "I gave you what you wanted. You wanted a new house, a new life. But that wasn't enough, was it? You want to take it all back, like it was before? Maybe go back to this bed, this house, and keep lying." Kaylee cried. The tears wouldn't stop, but Matt didn't care. He was indifferent. He was ready for this, even if it meant leaving Kaylee in the state she was in. "I'm not asking you to come back, Matt. I'm just asking." Her voice broke, and she couldn't say any more. Matt turned to her and, with a cold expression, said, "You should have thought about that earlier, Kaylee. Now nothing can be undone. Everything's taken, and you don't have a right to it anymore." Kaylee tried to say something, but the words were already meaningless. She understood that all that was left was a scream. She couldn't stay here, in this house, with everything that remained. She felt like her whole world was crashing down. "You're not giving this back to me, Matt?" she asked, even though she knew the answer. "You're not giving me back everything I once had?" "No," he replied simply. "I'm taking everything you wanted to take from me, and nothing more." Kaylee tried one last time to forgive him for everything that had happened, but her words no longer had power. All that remained between them now was a dark wall of unforgiveness. And Matt knew that this wasn't the final step. It was only the beginning. Matt left the house, leaving Kaylee alone. He no longer felt deceived. He felt strong, stronger than he had been in a long time. And even though it hurt, even though he had paid a high price for it, he was no longer the one who would allow himself to be manipulated. All that remained was the certainty that he hadn't lost anything important anymore. What do you think? Was Matt's revenge fair? He took everything from their home, even the furniture Kaylee had carefully chosen for her new life with Dylan. Should he have gone to such radical lengths, or was he simply giving way to his anger? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to tell us. Could you do the same?